My name is Ellie. I am 31 years old. 3 weeks ago, my Uncle Thomas sat at my kitchen island, looked me right in the face, and told me he had sold my grandfather's 70-acre farm. He claimed the estate was bankrupt, and he handled the transaction quietly 3 years ago to spare our family the burden. The sale closed years ago, he said, sipping a lukewarm beer. It is done. Let the old man rest. I did not yell. I did not throw the stack of heavily redacted closing documents he slid across the marble counter. I just watched him walk out my front door into the humid Baltimore night. He thought I would accept his story because I was just his quiet niece. He assumed I would not pull the county records. But I did. And what I found on the second page of that warranty deed proved that my own blood had committed a felony to steal our legacy. Before I tell you what I found in those records and how it forced me into a brutal legal war with a corporate developer, take a second to like and subscribe to Sophie Tells Stories. Drop a comment telling me your age, where you are watching from, and what time it is right now. Now let me take you back to that sweltering Tuesday evening in Fells Point when the lies began to unravel. The summer humidity in Baltimore clings to everything. It makes the air heavy and hard to breathe. That is exactly how my cramped rowhouse felt the moment Thomas delivered his news. He leaned against my kitchen counter, projecting the weary aura of a self-sacrificing patriarch. He spun a narrative about hidden medical debts and back taxes. He painted Grandpa Henry as a proud, failing man who had run the Harford County farm into the ground out of sheer stubbornness. I sold it to a commercial developer called Apex Holdings, Thomas explained. His tone was low and calibrated to sound comforting. I took care of the mess during his last hospital stint. I did not want you or your sister carrying that weight. You girls have your own lives to build. I stood by the sink, gripping a damp dish towel. My mind snagged on the timeline he was presenting. Grandpa spent his final hospital stay heavily medicated. He suffered from severe Parkinson's disease near the end. He could barely hold a plastic spoon to feed himself, let alone negotiate a complex real estate transaction with a billion-dollar firm. A vivid memory broke through the haze of Thomas's excuses. I remembered an afternoon just months before Grandpa passed. He was sitting on the sagging front porch of the farmhouse, gripping his rusted fishing tackle box. That box still smells faintly of Old Bay, seasoning a permanent fixture on a shelf in my basement. He had traced the metal latch with a shaking, calloused finger and muttered to me, "I put a lock on the soil, Ellie. A lock no banker can pick." I had dismissed it back then as the rambling of a failing mind. I thought it was just the dementia talking. Standing in my kitchen, facing my uncle, those words echoed loud and clear. They did not sound like dementia. They sounded like a warning. "He could not hold a pen 3 years ago, Thomas," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. Thomas did not raise his voice. He sighed, rubbing his temples to display his exhaustion. He told me I was being overly sentimental. He suggested I was letting grief cloud my judgment. He tapped the stack of papers on the counter, told me to leave it alone, and walked out. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, leaving a thick, suffocating stillness in my house. Have you ever felt that sudden cold drop in your gut when a relative's story contains a glaring, undeniable gap in logic? The kind of realization that makes your pulse hammer against your ribs because you know they are lying right to your face. The moment the taillights of his truck faded down the cobblestone street, I grabbed my laptop. My uncle thought I was naive. He forgot what I do for a living. As a historic preservation coordinator, I spent half my life navigating municipal zoning maps and property deeds. I bypassed the heavily redacted papers he left behind. I logged directly into the Maryland Land Records portal. I needed to see the original warranty deed transferring the Harford County farm to Apex Holdings. I needed to see the paperwork with my own eyes. I typed in the parcel identification number. The loading icon spun for what felt like an hour. When the digital scan of the deed finally populated on my screen, I scrolled straight past the legal jargon to the bottom of the second page. I zoomed in on the signature line. My breath hitched in my throat. Grandpa Henry had a severe tremor. His writing was always a jagged, painful, barely legible scrawl. But the signature on this official deed was a fluid, perfectly looped cursive. It was a forgery. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I looked closer at the notary stamp verifying the fraudulent signature. The name printed in stark black ink was Richard Calloway, a private contractor. I did not know it yet, but that specific notary stamp was the thread that would eventually unravel a multi-million-dollar corporate conspiracy. I sat at my kitchen island staring at the glowing screen until my eyes burned. The implications settled over me like a physical weight. My uncle had orchestrated a felony. He had stolen 70 acres of rich Maryland soil, a place that held generations of our history. I picked up my phone and called an independent real estate attorney I knew from my preservation work. It was early the next morning. The lawyer listened to my rapid explanation and delivered a harsh reality check. Uncovering a forgery does not magically revert a property title. He warned me, his voice serious. Apex Holdings is a massive entity with heavily armed legal teams. Challenging their ownership means initiating a grueling civil lawsuit. It will take upwards of 18 months just to reach the discovery phase. They will try to bury you in legal fees before you ever see a courtroom. I hung up the phone feeling entirely overwhelmed. I was a city employee with a modest savings account. I had no war chest to fight a corporate giant. I assumed I had time to gather my thoughts and formulate a plan. I was devastatingly wrong. Apex Holdings already knew I was looking. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived at my rowhouse. The thick envelope bore the gold-embossed logo of a prominent downtown law firm. Inside was a formal cease and desist demand. The letter warned me to stop inquiring about the Harford County title or face a crippling defamation lawsuit. They threatened to seize my personal assets if I continued to harass their client. The developers were not just defending their purchase, they were attacking me. The quiet grief over losing the farm had instantly mutated into a terrifying legal siege, and my own uncle had opened the gates for them. The glow of my laptop screen cast long, harsh shadows across the kitchen island. I sat alone in the humid Baltimore night, the digital scan of the warranty deed staring back at me. I had just watched my uncle walk out the door, peddling a narrative of financial ruin and benevolent sacrifice. But the document rendering the Harford County farm to Apex Holdings told a very different story. I zoomed in on the bottom of the second page. The signature line held the name Henry Arthur Vance. To a bank clerk or a municipal archivist, the ink looked official. The letters were crafted with a fluid, perfectly looped cursive, executed with the confident pressure of a steady hand. To me, that smooth blue ink was a glaring, undeniable siren. Grandpa Henry spent his final 5 years fighting a losing battle against Parkinson's disease. I remembered his 85th birthday sitting at the scarred wooden dining table in the farmhouse. He had tried to endorse a small check for my sister. It took him 3 minutes to steady his wrist enough to press the pen to paper. His authentic signature was a jagged, painful scrawl, punctuated by deep ink blots where the pen stalled against his tremors. He held his tools with calloused, soil-stained fingers, but near the end, his nervous system betrayed him. The man who signed this warranty deed possessed the motor control of a seasoned calligrapher. My uncle had not just bent the truth to cover up a quiet sale. He had orchestrated a felony. A cold sweat prickled the back of my neck, sticking my shirt to my skin. The audacity of the crime made my stomach churn. I scrolled down, focusing on the bottom corner of the page. Right below the forged signature sat a circular notary seal. The stamp verified the identity of the signer, giving the fraudulent document its legal armor. The name printed inside the official ring read, Richard Calloway. I opened a new browser tab. The house was quiet except for the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. As a preservation coordinator, I tracked down obscure contractors and historic property owners for a living. I know how to dig through state licensing boards. I typed Richard Calloway into the Maryland Registry of Commissioned Notaries. The search results returned a sparse profile. Calloway was listed as an independent contractor, but his registered business address was not a standalone office. It mapped to a commercial suite in a high-rise downtown. I pulled up the commercial directory for that specific building. The primary tenant occupying that entire floor was Apex Holdings. The pieces clicked together, forming a terrifying picture. Thomas had not simply found a random buyer. The developer had supplied their own internal notary to rubber stamp a forged document, bypassing standard legal safeguards to quietly swallow 70 acres of prime agricultural real estate. I closed my laptop as the first pale streaks of dawn crept over the brick row houses across the street. I had not slept a single minute. I brewed a pot of strong black coffee, my hands shaking as I poured the dark liquid into a mug. I waited until exactly 8 in the morning before picking up my phone. I dialed David Sterling, an independent real estate attorney I frequently consulted during complex city preservation disputes. David was a pragmatic, cynical lawyer who operated out of a cramped office near the Inner Harbor. He did not sugarcoat his advice. I paced the length of my narrow living room, clutching the phone to my ear. I outlined the situation with rapid, breathless precision. I described the fake signature, Grandpa's medical history, and the suspicious notary address linked to the corporate developer. I expected David to share my outrage. I expected him to tell me we could march into a courtroom, present the medical records, and void the deed by noon. Instead, he delivered a crushing dose of bureaucratic reality. "Ellie, you need to listen to me very carefully," David said. His voice was flat, devoid of any cinematic righteous anger. Having the truth and proving a title defect in a court of law are two entirely different universes. I stopped pacing. "What do you mean it is an obvious forgery? A medical expert can testify that he could not write like that." David let out a long, heavy sigh. Uncovering a forgery does not magically revert a property title. You are not dealing with a sloppy neighborhood flipper. Apex Holdings is a billion-dollar corporate entity. They do not just buy land, they buy legal fortresses. Their title insurance policies are ironclad, underwritten by multinational banks. He laid out the grueling timeline. He explained that challenging their ownership meant initiating a complex civil lawsuit to quiet title. The burden of proof would rest entirely on my shoulders. I would have to hire forensic handwriting analysts to pose the notary and subpoena my uncle. Just to reach the discovery phase where we can compel them to hand over internal emails will take upwards of 18 months, David warned. And during those 18 months, Apex will deploy a team of corporate litigators whose sole job is to bury you in procedural motions. They will demand endless hearings. They will request every financial record you possess. They operate on a strategy of attrition. They win by bankrupting the plaintiff before a judge ever sees the forged signature. My chest tightened. The air in my kitchen suddenly felt too thin. How much of a retainer are we talking about to initiate the filing and survive the first wave of their retaliatory motions? "I need $15,000 in an escrow account by Friday," David answered, "and that is just the entry fee." I looked around my modest rowhouse. I worked a public sector job. My savings account held roughly $4,000 set aside for emergency roof repairs. I did not have the capital to wage a multi-year war against a real estate empire. "If you pull this thread," David cautioned, his tone turning remarkably gentle, "they are not going to roll over and hand you the keys to the farm. They are going to view you as a threat to a highly profitable subdivision. They will hit back hard. You need to decide if this fight is worth burning your own life down." I thanked him, my voice barely a whisper, and ended the call. I sank onto a wooden stool at the kitchen island, resting my forehead against the cool marble. The overwhelming scale of the injustice threatened to crush my resolve. My uncle had sold out our family legacy, and the legal system designed to protect us required a ransom I could not pay. I felt cornered, outgunned, and profoundly isolated. I stood up and walked over to the front window to open the blinds, hoping the morning light would clear the dark fog in my head. As I pulled the cord, my gaze drifted to the narrow cobblestone street outside. Parked directly across from my front steps, wedged between two older sedans, was a sleek black SUV with heavily tinted windows. The engine was idling. A faint plume of exhaust curled into the humid morning air. I watched the vehicle for a long moment. Delivery drivers and neighbors rarely idled on this narrow residential block. The timing felt too precise. A cold spike of dread traveled down my spine. When I accessed the Maryland Land Records portal hours earlier, I had used my personal credential login, a requirement for pulling high-resolution digital deed scans. In my frantic rush to uncover the truth, I had left a digital footprint. Apex Holdings possessed the resources to monitor inquiries on their disputed parcels. I took a slow step back from the glass, letting the blinds fall shut. I was standing in my own home holding the evidence of a felony, yet I was the one who felt hunted. I had stumbled onto a corporate crime unaware that pulling the curtain back meant the predators were already watching me. The black SUV parked outside my row house did not linger into the daylight, but the message it delivered was undeniable. Apex Holdings knew I had accessed the land records. I spent the next day jumping at every creak of the floorboards, expecting a corporate lawyer to step out of the humid Baltimore air. The retaliation arrived much faster than David predicted, and it did not come in the form of a polite phone call or a warning email. It was Thursday afternoon. A sharp knock echoed through the narrow hallway of my house. I opened the door to find a man wearing a faded Orioles baseball cap, holding a thick manila envelope. He handed it to me, stated I had been served, and walked down the brick steps without another word. I carried the package to my kitchen island and tore open the flap. The documents inside bore the intimidating letterhead of a prominent downtown litigation firm. I was holding a strategic lawsuit against public participation. In the legal sector, they call it a SLAPP suit. It is a predatory maneuver designed by deep-pocketed corporations to silence individuals who ask too many questions. The lawsuit accused me of tortious interference and threatened a crippling defamation claim if I continued to investigate the Harford County title. The developers demanded an immediate written retraction of my inquiries. The sheer weight of the legal jargon was engineered to paralyze me with fear. The documents clearly implied that if I fought back, they would drag me into a protracted court battle, draining my modest city employee's salary before a judge ever reviewed the forged signature. I was standing at the counter, staring at the thick stack of threats, when the front door swung open. My younger sister Sarah walked in using her spare key. She was still wearing her blue scrubs from her shift at the local medical clinic. Sarah usually avoids my house unless we have a planned dinner, but today her posture was rigid, and her breathing was shallow and uneven. Seeing her standing in my hallway triggered a dark, festering suspicion in my mind. When Thomas had visited my house 3 days prior to deliver the news about the farm, he had intentionally dropped a subtle, deceptive breadcrumb. Right before he walked out the door, he had casually mentioned that I should ask Sarah how she managed to pay off her remaining student loans last year. He expertly planted the idea that Sarah had received a secret payout from the illicit farm sale. Under the crushing pressure of the corporate lawsuit sitting in front of me, that planted seed blossomed into pure paranoia. I did not greet her. I slammed the legal documents onto the marble counter and accused her of selling out our grandfather's legacy. I demanded to know how much Apex Holdings had paid her to look the other way while our uncle forged the warranty deed. Sarah flinched as if I had struck her across the face. She stared at me, genuine shock washing over her features. Tears instantly welled in her eyes, spilling over her eyelashes and cutting tracks down her tired cheeks. She had no idea what I was talking about regarding a corporate payout. She was not a complicit conspirator in real estate fraud. She was a terrified daughter caught in a psychological snare. Through ragged sobs, Sarah dismantled my accusation and revealed a devastating truth I had entirely missed. Thomas had not paid off her student loans to buy her silence. He had paid them off to ensure her unwavering loyalty because he was holding our mother hostage financially. Our mother resides in an expensive assisted living facility in Towson. She requires specialized round-the-clock care for her declining cognitive health. The monthly invoice is staggering, far beyond what my public sector salary or Sarah's clinic wages can cover. Sarah confessed that Thomas had been quietly funding the facility out of his own pocket for the past 2 years. He stepped in when our mother's savings dried up, playing the role of the devoted brother. The psychological trap Thomas engineered was brilliant and cruel. He had called Sarah late the previous night, weaving a masterful narrative of victimhood. He told her I was trying to send him to federal prison over a minor paperwork error regarding the old farm. He made it explicitly clear that if he faced criminal charges and his bank accounts were frozen by the state, the payments to the Towson facility would immediately cease. Our mother would be evicted within 30 days. Without his financial support, she would be transferred to an underfunded, grim state ward where the nurses are overworked and the residents are often forgotten. Thomas weaponized the survival of our mother against us. He forced Sarah to choose between a piece of stolen land in Harford County and the physical safety of the woman who raised us. Sarah stepped toward the kitchen island, her voice rising in a desperate plea. She begged me to drop the investigation. She pleaded with me to throw away the forged deed and ignore the corporate lawsuit. She did not care about historic preservation or property rights. She cared about our mother having a clean bed and a care team who remembered her name. I tried to explain the magnitude of the crime. I tried to make her understand that Apex Holdings was using a fake notary to steal 70 acres of our family history. I pointed to the SLAPP suit on the counter, trying to show her that the developers were already trying to crush me. Sarah shook her head, refusing to listen to the legal mechanics. She accused me of being selfish. She said I cared more about being right and winning a fight with Thomas than I cared about the actual living members of our family. The accusation cut deep, striking a raw nerve. The exhaustion from sleepless nights, the paralyzing dread of the SLAPP suit, and the suffocating guilt regarding our mother collided in my chest. The pressure boiled over. I lost my grip on my composure. In a moment of raw, imperfect frustration, I swept my arm hard across the kitchen counter. My hand connected with a cluster of ceramic coffee mugs resting near the sink. They launched off the marble edge and crashed against the exposed brick wall of my kitchen. The sharp, piercing sound of shattering ceramic echoed through the narrow rowhouse. Coffee stains splattered across the red brick, dripping slowly down to the floorboards. The physical outburst was not calculated or cinematic. It was an ugly, desperate loss of control from someone pushed beyond their breaking point. Sarah gasped, taking a stumbling step backward toward the hallway. The argument died instantly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating quiet. She looked at the broken pieces on the floor, then at me, her expression shifting from anger to profound disappointment. Without uttering another word, she turned and hurried out the front door. The lock clicked shut, leaving me entirely isolated. I stood alone in the humid kitchen, staring down at the shattered mugs, trapped between the relentless machinery of a billionaire developer and the fragile survival of my own mother. My uncle had ensured that fighting for the truth would cost me everything I loved. The sharp, jagged fragments of the shattered coffee mugs still littered my kitchen floor the next morning. I had not swept them up. The physical mess mirrored the devastating emotional wreckage my argument with Sarah had left behind. My sister was not returning my text messages, and the paralyzing guilt of jeopardizing our mother's care facility pressed heavily on my shoulders. I was trapped in a suffocating stalemate, debating whether walking away from the Harford County farm was the only way to protect my family from total collapse. I was mentally drafting an email of surrender to the developers when the postal carrier dropped the Daily Mail through the brass slot in my front door. The stack hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. Sitting at the top of the pile was a thick, certified envelope. The return address did not belong to Apex Holdings or their aggressive litigation firm. It belonged to a prominent, notoriously predatory medical debt collection agency operating out of a corporate park in Colombia. I tore the perforated edge of the envelope, assuming it was a routine billing error related to a recent urgent care visit. As I unfolded the heavy legal paper, the bold red ink at the top of the document stopped the air in my lungs. It was a formal notice of a mechanic's judgment lien placed directly onto the deed of my Fells Point rowhouse. I gripped the edge of the kitchen island to steady my trembling knees. A judgment lien is an aggressive legal tool used by creditors to force the sale of a property to satisfy an unpaid debt. It meant the collection agency legally anchored a massive financial burden to my primary residence. If I attempted to sell or refinance my home, or if the debt remained unsatisfied, the creditors possessed the legal authority to foreclose on the property and auction it off to recoup their losses. I forced my eyes to focus on the itemized ledger printed on the second page. The document outlined a staggering defaulted balance of just over $80,000. The origin of the debt was listed as a high-interest medical bridge loan secured 3.5 years ago. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The timeline aligned perfectly with the darkest chapter of my uncle's life. Thomas's wife, my Aunt Claire, had fought a brutal, accelerated battle with early-onset Alzheimer's disease. In her final months, traditional insurance refused to cover the experimental, highly specialized clinical trials Thomas desperately sought. He drained his retirement accounts and liquidated his personal assets trying to save her. I always believed he handled the resulting financial devastation quietly. The reality was much darker. Thomas had not just forged Grandpa Henry's signature on the warranty deed to sell the farm to Apex Holdings. Years prior, long before the farm transaction closed, he required a guarantor to secure the massive predatory medical bridge loan. His credit was ruined and his assets were exhausted. So he utilized the exact same corrupt notary he would later use for the farm sale to forge my signature on the guarantor paperwork. He attached my name and my public sector salary to a loan he knew he could never repay. When the high-interest debt inevitably defaulted and the collection agency initiated their aggressive asset search, they tracked down the fraudulent guarantor paperwork and slammed the judgment lien directly onto the deed of my home. I sank onto a wooden stool, the air in my kitchen growing thin and unbreathable. The sheer scale of the betrayal was staggering. Thomas had not just stolen land from a dead man. He had weaponized my identity to finance his desperation, secretly chaining my financial survival to his sinking ship. The mechanic's lien was not just a debt collection strategy, it was his ultimate insurance policy. If I marched into a courtroom and exposed his real estate fraud regarding the Harford County farm, his entire financial history would be subjected to intense judicial scrutiny. The moment a judge ordered an audit of his assets, the bank holding the defaulted medical loan would instantly flag the fraudulent guarantor paperwork attached to my name. Exposing the farm forgery would automatically trigger the default clause on the bridge loan, initiating an immediate foreclosure process on my Fells Point rowhouse. I pulled my phone from my pocket with numb fingers and called David Sterling, my real estate attorney. My voice was tight and ragged as I read the lien notice to him over the phone. I asked him if we could simply file a police report for identity theft and have the lien removed before we attacked Apex Holdings. David delivered another harsh dose of bureaucratic reality. Untangling a fraudulent loan of this magnitude is not a swift administrative process. The bank will not simply accept your word that the signature is forged. Removing a recorded judgment lien requires months of intense civil litigation. We will have to hire specialized forensic handwriting analysts, depose the notary again, and engage in complex coordination with financial crime investigators. He explained that during those grueling months of litigation, the $80,000 lien would remain active on my title. The cloud over my property would decimate my credit score and leave me constantly vulnerable to a forced sheriff's sale if the collection agency decided to accelerate their collection efforts. I was staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. I hung up the phone and let it clatter onto the marble counter. I sat in my dark kitchen hyperventilating as the suffocating weight of the $80,000 debt crushed my chest. Thomas had engineered an impossible, agonizing paradox. I could not challenge the corporate developer without triggering the financial bomb my uncle had strapped to my own life. We often believe that fighting for justice is a straightforward, righteous path. We assume the truth is a shield that will protect us from the fallout. But what happens when pulling the trigger on the truth guarantees the destruction of your own shelter? How do you fight for a stolen legacy when the predator holds the deed to your own home? The psychological pressure cooker reached a critical breaking point. I was trapped between an aggressive corporate SLAPP suit threatening to bankrupt me in civil court, a forged medical debt threatening to leave me homeless on the streets of Baltimore, and a sister begging me to abandon the fight to keep our mother out of a state-run ward. I had zero leverage, zero capital, and no clean exit strategy. I stared at the broken coffee mug still scattered across the brick floor. My uncle assumed the crushing weight of the mechanic's lien would force my silence. He assumed I would absorb his felony to protect my own sanctuary. He calculated that I lacked the endurance to wage a war on 3 fronts simultaneously. I realized that surviving this legal siege required a profound, terrifying shift in tactics. I could not fight a multi-million-dollar developer and a desperate relative using conventional outrage. I needed to find a bureaucratic mechanism powerful enough to paralyze their operations without triggering my own financial destruction. I had to learn how to weaponize the very system they used to trap me. The crippling realization of the mechanic's lien anchored to my Fells Point rowhouse forced me into a state of stunned paralysis. I spent 2 full days ignoring phone calls, drafting unsent emails to my sister, and staring blankly at the exposed brick wall of my kitchen. The crushing $80,000 medical debt Thomas had fraudulently attached to my name felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I debated simply walking away. I considered surrendering Grandpa Henry's legacy to spare my mother the trauma of a state-run ward and to protect my own sanctuary from foreclosure. That brief period of agonizing surrender was violently shattered on a humid Thursday morning. The timeline of the corporate siege compressed with terrifying speed, stripping away any illusion that I could quietly retreat. My phone vibrated on the marble island, startling me out of my exhausted daze. The caller ID displayed the name of Mr. Henderson, an elderly farmer whose property bordered the northern edge of the Harford County farm. He had known Grandpa Henry for decades and often kept a watchful eye on the abandoned acreage since the quiet sale. I answered the call expecting a routine check-in. Instead, Mr. Henderson sounded breathless and frantic over the roar of heavy machinery in the background. "Ellie, you need to get up here right now," he shouted into the receiver. "There are 3 massive diesel bulldozers parked on your grandfather's front lawn. A crew is unloading industrial demolition equipment. They are marking the perimeter around the old stone smokehouse." The blood drained from my face. I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles turning bone white. I asked him if he was sure they were prepping for demolition. "They put up a chain-link construction fence this morning," he confirmed, the sharp sound of a diesel engine revving punctuating his sentence. "A foreman just nailed a municipal clearing permit to the front gate. They are going to level the entire property, Ellie. The smokehouse, the barn, the main residence. All of it." I hung up the phone, my heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. A sickening wave of adrenaline flooded my system. The mystery that had plagued my initial investigation suddenly snapped into a devastatingly clear picture. When I first uncovered the forged warranty deed, I could not understand why Apex Holdings purchased the 70 acres 3 years ago, but allowed the prime real estate to sit dormant and overgrown. Commercial developers do not hold inventory without a lucrative motive. The puzzle pieces finally aligned. The Harford County farm sat precariously close to the delicate, highly regulated tributaries feeding into the Chesapeake Bay. Apex Holdings had not been sitting idle. They had been trapped in municipal zoning purgatory. For 36 months, their ambitious subdivision plans were stalled by stringent environmental impact studies and fierce regulatory battles mandated by the Chesapeake Bay Critical Area Commission. They had been fighting a quiet, relentless war against environmental regulators, pouring millions into lobbying efforts and revised ecological surveys. The appearance of the bulldozers on the front lawn meant only one thing. Apex Holdings had finally secured the elusive municipal green light. They possessed the coveted permits required to break ground, and they were wasting no time executing their vision. The developer planned to bulldoze the 100-year-old stone smokehouse and the main property before the end of the month. It was a terrifying, accelerating ticking clock. If those historic structures were demolished, the cultural and sentimental value of the farm would be permanently erased. The physical evidence of my family's history would be reduced to a pile of rubble and hauled away to a landfill, paving the way for a sterile concrete subdivision. The $80,000 lien anchoring my rowhouse demanded my immediate attention, but the roaring diesel engines threatening my grandfather's legacy demanded immediate action. I had to compartmentalize my mounting personal debt and suppress the suffocating terror of foreclosure. I needed a bureaucratic weapon powerful enough to stop a fleet of bulldozers, and I needed it before the sun went down. I am not a corporate litigator, and I do not possess a multi-million-dollar legal war chest. However, as a historic preservation coordinator for the city of Baltimore, I wield a very specific, highly specialized arsenal. I spend my professional life navigating the labyrinthine corridors of municipal heritage codes and architectural conservation statutes. I know how to throw bureaucratic wrenches into the gears of rapid urban development. I opened my laptop and brewed a pot of incredibly strong bitter coffee. I worked relentlessly through the night, the blue light of the screen burning my exhausted eyes. I pulled every archival document, county land survey, and historical architectural text I could locate regarding the Harford County region. I drafted a comprehensive aggressive emergency injunction petition directed at the Harford County Historical Society. I did not base my argument on the forged warranty deed or the pending SLAPP suit. Those issues belonged in a civil courtroom and would take months to litigate. Instead, I focused my entire strategy on the weathered stone walls of the smokehouse sitting on the property. I argued that the 100-year-old structure featured a rare undocumented masonry technique utilized by early Maryland settlers. I submitted a meticulously researched brief claiming the smokehouse held unassessed critical architectural significance that required a mandatory formal evaluation by state historians before any demolition permits could be legally executed. It was a desperate, highly technical Hail Mary. I was weaponizing obscure heritage preservation codes to stall a billion-dollar corporate subdivision. I submitted the emergency petition the moment the municipal offices opened the following morning. I spent the next 48 hours pacing my living room, jumping every time my phone buzzed, praying the bureaucratic machinery would move faster than the developer's wrecking crew. On Friday afternoon, an official email arrived from the Historical Commission. The board had reviewed my submission and acknowledged the potential architectural merit of the stone structure. They formally granted a temporary mandatory 30-day halt on all demolition activities on the parcel pending a comprehensive historical site survey. I collapsed onto a kitchen stool, letting out a long, ragged breath. I had successfully paralyzed the bulldozers. I bought myself exactly 1 month of breathing room to untangle the forged deed and confront my uncle. However, utilizing my professional expertise to blockade their flagship development project proved to be a dangerous escalation. Apex Holdings did not view my emergency injunction as a minor administrative delay. They recognized it as a targeted hostile strike against their bottom line. A 30-day halt on a commercial construction site costs a developer hundreds of thousands of dollars in carrying costs and idle contractor fees. They were absolutely furious. The corporate retaliation was immediate and deeply personal. They realized they could not easily defeat the historical preservation statutes I had invoked, so they decided to attack the source. If they could not legally bulldoze the smokehouse, they would systematically destroy the credibility of the preservation coordinator protecting it. Less than 24 hours after the commission granted the demolition halt, a courier arrived at my rowhouse. He did not hand me another cease and desist letter. He handed me a formal court-ordered subpoena. Apex Holdings' aggressive litigation team commanded my presence for a full-day hostile deposition at their downtown corporate headquarters. They were hauling me into a freezing conference room to place my entire professional and personal history under oath. They intended to execute a brutal, calculated interrogation designed to portray my emergency injunction as a fraudulent, malicious tactic fueled by a bitter family dispute. They planned to crush my historic preservation claim by obliterating my personal credibility on the official record, paving the way for a judge to lift the demolition halt and allow the bulldozers to roll. The corporate headquarters of Apex Holdings occupied the top 3 floors of a shimmering glass tower near the inner harbor. The lobby smelled faintly of expensive floor wax and stale coffee. I stepped out of the elevator into a reception area that felt designed to intimidate. Polished steel surfaces and sharp minimalist furniture projected an aura of cold, unyielding corporate dominance. I was directed into a cavernous conference room. The air conditioning was turned down so low it raised goosebumps on my arms. I took my seat next to my attorney David at the center of a massive mahogany table. Directly across from me sat the lead litigator for Apex Holdings, a man whose tailored suit and meticulously combed hair screamed expensive billable hours. He arranged his thick stacks of manila folders with a practiced, predatory efficiency. The court reporter sat at the head of the table, her fingers poised over the stenotype machine, ready to permanently document every word spoken. The environment was sterile freezing and engineered to strip away any sense of personal comfort. The door opened a few minutes later, and the true horror of the deposition walked into the room. Uncle Thomas entered, accompanied by his own harried-looking attorney. Apex Holdings had subpoenaed him to officially validate the original sale of the Harford County farm. Seeing him take his seat across from me sent a sharp, painful jolt through my chest. He looked significantly older than he had just a few weeks prior in my kitchen. His shoulders slumped beneath a dated, oversized sport coat, and the dark circles under his eyes spoke of chronic exhaustion. We were locked in a bitter dispute, but looking at his familiar, weathered face, the weight of our shared history pressed down heavily on me. The Apex litigator did not begin with standard procedural questions. He did not ask about dates or municipal zoning codes. He bypassed the bureaucratic mechanics entirely and launched a targeted, highly personal assault aimed directly at dismantling my character on the official record. He interrogated me about my salary as a city employee, subtly implying that my modest income fueled a desperate resentment toward my wealthier uncle. He weaponized my recent argument with Sarah, twisting the sisterly fight into evidence of a hostile, volatile temperament. He painted a picture of a greedy, estranged niece attempting to extort a massive payout from a legitimate corporate developer under the guise of historic preservation. I tried to remain calm. I tried to deliver crisp, objective answers regarding the forged signature and the architectural significance of the stone smokehouse. But the litigator was a master of psychological pressure. He continuously interrupted my responses, talking over me and demanding yes or no answers to complex, nuanced questions. Then the litigator shifted his focus to Thomas. The questions were designed to allow my uncle to establish his credibility and validate the disputed warranty deed. I expected Thomas to act defensive or perhaps stumble over his fabricated timeline. I anticipated catching him in a lie that David could exploit. I severely underestimated the depth of his desperation. Thomas did not act like a cornered criminal. He weaponized his genuine, agonizing grief, turning the deposition into a heart-wrenching theatrical performance. When asked why he sold the farm so quietly 3 years ago, Thomas's voice cracked. Tears welled in his tired eyes and spilled over his weathered cheeks. He did not talk about real estate markets or estate planning. He talked about his late wife, Claire. He recounted in excruciating detail the brutal, accelerated decline of her early-onset Alzheimer's disease. He described the terrifying nights she wandered out of their house, not knowing her own name. He detailed the exorbitant costs of the specialized memory care units and the experimental clinical trials that traditional insurance refused to cover. I watched the court reporter's fingers fly across the keys, capturing every devastating syllable. Thomas painted himself as a devoted, broken husband who had watched the woman he loved slowly disappear. He testified that he legally sold the abandoned, dilapidated farm to save his family from total financial ruin. He claimed Grandpa Henry had fully authorized the sale to help pay for Claire's mounting medical debts, insisting the signature on the deed was authentic and witnessed by a trusted associate. Then Thomas turned his tear-filled eyes directly toward me. He delivered the final crushing blow. He testified that he was currently funding my mother's expensive assisted living facility in Towson because I refused to contribute. He stated under oath that my malicious, unfounded lawsuit against Apex Holdings was threatening to bankrupt him, which would inevitably result in my own mother being thrown into a grim, underfunded state ward. He portrayed me as a monster, a selfish, vindictive relative willing to destroy a grieving widower and jeopardize a vulnerable mother simply to cling to a useless patch of dirt. The sheer emotional manipulation was suffocating. He was using the very real tragedy of Aunt Claire's illness to validate a felony, and he was using my mother's fragile health as a shield against the truth. There were no clever cinematic comebacks waiting on the tip of my tongue. I did not maintain the stoic perfection of a seasoned professional. The relentless, humiliating questioning from the corporate litigator, combined with the devastating betrayal from my own uncle, broke my composure entirely. My throat constricted tight and aching. The sterile conference room seemed to tilt. Hot, messy tears blurred my vision, spilling down my face right in front of the court reporter. I tried to wipe them away angrily, but my hands were shaking too severely. I looked frantic, defensive, and deeply unstable. The calculated, poised, historic preservation coordinator they expected had crumbled into a weeping, hysterical mess. I had lost control of the narrative, confirming every hostile insinuation the litigator had planted. David immediately requested a 15-minute recess. He grabbed my elbow and ushered me out of the freezing conference room and into a small adjacent huddle room. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, sealing us inside. I leaned against the wall, taking short, ragged breaths, trying to stop the tears. I apologized profusely, feeling entirely humiliated by my public breakdown. David did not offer warm comfort. He ran a hand through his hair and delivered a harsh, tactical assessment. "Ellie, you need to pull it together right now," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Your emotional collapse is precisely what Apex wanted. They are baiting you. They want the official transcript to read like the ramblings of an unstable, bitter relative." He explained their strategy with cold precision. Apex intended to use this deposition transcript to petition a judge to lift the 30-day demolition halt I had secured on the smokehouse. If I appeared unhinged and motivated by family vengeance rather than legitimate historic preservation concerns, the judge would likely toss my emergency injunction out of court. The bulldozers would be cleared to roll by the end of the week. I squeezed my eyes shut, the weight of the $80,000 fraudulent mechanics lien on my rowhouse and the impending destruction of the farm crushing my resolve. Thomas's performance had been flawless. Apex was acting invincible confident in their multi-million-dollar legal machinery. What I did not know as I stood trembling in that small huddle room was that the entire situation carried a dark, dramatic irony. Apex Holdings felt untouchable because they believed they had successfully buried the evidence of the forgery. They assumed Thomas's heartbreaking testimony would permanently validate the warranty deed. They were entirely unaware that I was about to stumble onto the thread that would unravel their entire corporate empire. They were acting invincible, yet I was completely ignorant of the fact that their own internal notary had facilitated the felony, making them not just aggressive developers, but criminal co-conspirators. The deposition was meant to break me, but it was merely the preamble to an impossible choice that would force me to decide between saving my home and honoring my grandfather's legacy. I wiped my face with a rough paper towel, took a deep, shuddering breath, and followed David back into the freezing conference room. The atmosphere had shifted. The aggressive, predatory energy the Apex litigator projected earlier had cooled into a smug, quiet satisfaction. He believed he had broken me. The court reporter's hands rested idle on her machine. Uncle Thomas sat across the mahogany table, looking physically drained, his tear-streaked performance having achieved its intended effect. The lead counsel for Apex Holdings did not resume his brutal interrogation. Instead, he reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a slim manila folder. He slid it precisely across the polished wood until it stopped directly in front of me. "This does not need to get any uglier, Miss Vance," he said, his tone dripping with patronizing corporate grace. "We understand the emotional toll family disputes can take. We are prepared to offer a mutually beneficial resolution today." David opened the folder, his brow furrowed as his eyes scanned the dense legal text. I watched his jaw tighten, a clear indicator that the document contained something unexpected. The proposal was a predatory masterpiece. It was not a generous compromise. It was a highly calculated extortion tactic disguised as mercy. If I agreed to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and formally sign a quitclaim deed releasing any and all future claims to the Harford County farm, Apex Holdings would leverage their immense corporate capital to resolve my personal financial crisis. They explicitly offered to use their private funds to quietly pay off the $80,000 fraudulent medical lien currently anchoring my Fells Point rowhouse to foreclosure. The trap was incredibly sophisticated. They had done their homework. The developers knew about the mechanic's lien Thomas had strapped to my name long before I stepped foot in that deposition. They recognized that the looming threat of losing my primary residence was my ultimate vulnerability. They were offering to sever the chain Thomas had forged, effectively saving me from immediate bankruptcy and homelessness. The catch was absolute silence. Accepting their money meant legally acknowledging their fraudulent warranty deed as legitimate. It meant turning a blind eye to my uncle's felony and allowing the bulldozers to level the 100-year-old stone smokehouse without another word of protest. They were offering to save my home in exchange for my complicity in stealing my grandfather's legacy. "We will give you 72 hours to review the terms with your counsel," the litigator stated smoothly, snapping his briefcase shut. "If we do not have a signed agreement by close of business on Friday, we will petition the judge to lift the demolition halt immediately, and we will aggressively pursue the defamation counterclaims." The deposition concluded abruptly. I walked out of the towering glass headquarters feeling numb and disoriented. The humid Baltimore air hit me the moment I stepped onto the pavement, but the cold dread gripping my chest refused to thaw. For 3 agonizing days, I lived in a state of suffocating paralysis. The terror of losing my home was a relentless physical ache. I sat at my kitchen island staring at the collection notices from the medical debt agency, the bold red ink threatening a forced sheriff's sale. I pictured my belongings boxed up on the cobblestone street. I thought about the crushing reality of ruined credit and the terrifying prospect of trying to secure a new apartment with a massive judgment hovering over my name. The settlement offer was a lifeline. Signing the paper meant immediate salvation. It meant I could finally sleep through the night without waking up in a panic sweat. It meant Sarah and I would not have to wage a public war against our uncle, sparing our mother the traumatic fallout. The logical survivalist part of my brain screamed at me to take the corporate money and walk away. On Thursday afternoon, less than 24 hours before the apex deadline, the walls of my rowhouse felt too tight. I needed to clear my head. I grabbed my keys and drove out of the city, navigating the chaotic traffic of I-695 until the dense concrete sprawl gave way to the rolling green hills of Harford County. I pulled onto the narrow, familiar two-lane road and parked my car on the muddy shoulder. I killed the engine and stepped out into the quiet, rural air. The 70-acre farm looked profoundly different from the bustling, vibrant place of my childhood. The fields were overgrown with tall, tangled weeds. The white paint on the main farmhouse was peeling in long, brittle strips. The chain-link construction fence Apex had erected looked like a scar cutting across the front lawn. The massive yellow diesel bulldozers sat idle near the property line, waiting patiently for the order to tear it all down. I walked up to the edge of the fence, my fingers wrapping around the cold metal wire. I stared past the heavy machinery at the old stone smokehouse sitting near the back of the lot. The structure was weathered, the mortar crumbling in places, but it stood resilient against the passing decades. A vivid, unexpected memory hit me with sudden physical force. I was 10 years old. The late summer heat was thick, the air humming with the sound of cicadas. I was sitting on the wooden steps of the farmhouse porch, a massive pile of fresh Maryland Silver Queen corn piled between my knees. I was struggling to peel back the stubborn green husks. Grandpa Henry sat beside me on a worn wooden rocking chair. His hands were large, calloused, and permanently stained with dark soil from decades of working the fields. He possessed a quiet, steady strength that always made me feel safe. He reached over and effortlessly shucked an ear of corn, handing the bright yellow cob to me. He looked out over the sprawling acreage, his eyes squinting against the bright afternoon sun. He had just spent an hour on the phone arguing with a local bank executive regarding a minor zoning dispute. He hated dealing with bankers. He believed they only saw the land as numbers on a spreadsheet, entirely disconnected from the labor required to sustain it. He turned to me, his expression turning unusually serious. "Dirt is the only thing that outlasts a lie, Ellie," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Men will try to sell you a fast story for a quick dollar. They will try to build something shiny over the things that actually matter. Do not ever let them pave over the truth." The memory snapped back to the present. The humid breeze rustled the overgrown weeds near the chain-link fence. The silence of the abandoned farm was profound. I let go of the metal wire. The suffocating paralysis that had gripped me for 3 days finally broke. Signing the non-disclosure agreement meant becoming fully complicit in Thomas's crime. Taking the corporate settlement meant I was agreeing to pave over the truth Grandpa Henry had spent his life cultivating. The $80,000 lien threatening my home was terrifying, but I realized that saving my rowhouse by abandoning my grandfather's legacy would require a level of moral bankruptcy I could not live with. I pulled my phone from my pocket, right there on the muddy shoulder of the road. My hands were shaking, but my resolve was absolute. I dialed David's office. He answered on the second ring, his tone cautious, likely expecting me to authorize the settlement. I told him I was not signing the paper. I instructed him to formally, permanently reject the corporate offer. David was silent for a long moment. "Ellie," he warned quietly, "if we reject this, they are going to come after you with everything they have. They will contact the bank holding the lien on your house and accelerate the foreclosure process. The battle is going to get incredibly ugly." "I know," I replied, my voice steady, looking at the stone walls of the smokehouse. "Tell them we will see them in court." I hung up the phone and walked back to my car. I had rejected the corporate lifeline guaranteeing the destruction of my own financial stability. I chose to honor my grandfather over saving my house. I was bracing for a brutal, drawn-out legal war, confident I had taken the moral high ground. I did not realize that rejecting the settlement would immediately trigger a legal mechanism so aggressive It would force me to find the ultimate smoking gun within 14 days, setting the stage for a discovery that would blow the entire corporate conspiracy wide open. Rejecting the corporate bribe felt like stepping off a cliff without a parachute. I drove back to Baltimore in near silence, the radio off my mind racing through the impending fallout. David did not waste time mourning the lost settlement. The moment I gave him the green light, he shifted our strategy from a defensive posture into a calculated mechanical offense. He filed a document known as a lis pendens directly onto the deed of the Harford County farm at the county courthouse. In the legal sector, the term translates to a suit pending. In the ruthless arena of commercial real estate, it translates to poison. The document places a formal public notice on the property record, alerting the world that the title is currently subject to active litigation. This single sheet of paper acts as a radioactive cloud over the deed. Apex Holdings required immense capital to fund their planned residential subdivision. Developers do not use their own cash to build neighborhoods. They rely on commercial construction loans from institutional underwriters to finance the massive costs of grading soil and pouring foundations. No reputable bank will issue a construction loan on a parcel of land with a disputed title. The risk of the collateral being seized by a third party makes the investment uninsurable. By submitting a simple $50 filing fee, David and I successfully paralyzed a billion-dollar corporate project. We choked off their funding supply. The yellow diesel bulldozers parked near the stone smokehouse were suddenly rendered useless sitting idle, while the developer hemorrhaged carrying costs. I expected retaliation, but I underestimated the blistering speed of their corporate legal machinery. The response arrived 3 days later. I was sitting at my desk in the City Preservation Office reviewing zoning maps for an upcoming district meeting when a process server bypassed the reception desk and handed me a thick legal binder. Apex Holdings had filed an emergency motion to expunge the lis pendens. They bypassed the standard sluggish timeline of civil litigation by claiming my filing was a frivolous bad faith tactic designed solely to extort a legitimate business. They weaponized the legal system to force a rapid confrontation. A circuit court judge, eager to clear a clogged commercial docket, granted their request for an expedited evidentiary hearing. I stared at the stamped date on the front page of the motion. The hearing was scheduled in exactly 14 days. The attached legal memorandum laid out a terrifying ultimatum. During this expedited hearing, the burden of proof rested entirely on my shoulders. I had to walk into that courtroom and present concrete, undeniable evidence that the warranty deed was a forgery. If I failed to satisfy the judge, the court would not just lift the radioactive cloud from the title. The judge would penalize me by forcing me to pay the exorbitant legal fees Apex incurred to fight the notice, adding hundreds of thousands of dollars in corporate attorney fees to the $80,000 fraudulent medical lien already anchoring my rowhouse guaranteed inescapable bankruptcy. I would lose my home, my credit, and my grandfather's legacy in a single afternoon. The pressure cooker hit a boiling point. The most frustrating aspect of the impending hearing was the deceptive nature of the forged ink itself. To my eyes, the smooth, perfectly looped cursive on the warranty deed was an obvious fake. Grandpa Henry possessed a jagged, erratic handwriting style, a cruel byproduct of his deteriorating neurological health. Anyone who knew him could spot the discrepancy in seconds. However, a judge presiding over a high-stakes commercial dispute does not accept the visual assessment of an emotionally invested granddaughter. The legal standard required a certified forensic document examiner to testify under oath. Forensic handwriting analysts are rare, highly specialized experts. They require hefty upfront retainers and demand a minimum of 90 days to conduct microscopic ink analysis and prepare a defensible peer-reviewed report. The expedited 14-day timeline deliberately bypassed my ability to utilize a forensic expert. Apex Holdings engineered the hearing schedule specifically to neutralize my strongest piece of evidence. I could not prove the signature was fake within 2 weeks. The ink on the page was useless to me. I sat at my kitchen island that evening, the heavy legal binder resting next to the fading coffee stains on my exposed brick wall. If I could not prove the physical signature was forged in the allotted time, I had to change my entire approach. I had to prove the transaction itself was legally impossible. I needed to find a structural flaw in Thomas's narrative. I needed a legal silver bullet, and the clock was ticking down with unforgiving speed. I requested an emergency leave of absence from my preservation job the next morning. I transformed my narrow row house into a chaotic war room. I hauled every cardboard box of family documents up from my damp basement. For days, I barely slept. I existed on bitter coffee and sheer adrenaline, sorting through decades of my grandfather's life. I sifted through faded tax returns, obsolete utility bills, and cracked leather binders containing old tractor repair receipts. I was hunting for a hidden property addendum, an obscure banking record, or a forgotten piece of correspondence that contradicted the timeline of the farm sale. My living room floor became a sea of yellowed paper. The days slipped away, bleeding into one another. Day 4, Day 7, Day 10. Every dead end heightened the suffocating panic tightening around my chest. Thomas had been meticulous in covering his tracks, burning the bridges behind him when he orchestrated the fraudulent deed transfer. The physical exhaustion threatened to break my focus, but the looming specter of the circuit court hearing pushed me forward. I had 96 hours left before I had to stand before a judge and defend the filing. I was running out of boxes, running out of documents, and rapidly running out of hope. I needed a miracle hidden in the wreckage of my family's history, unaware that my desperate search was about to knock over a forgotten relic holding the exact key I needed to dismantle the corporate empire. The pressure of the impending circuit court hearing consumed every corner of my life. With less than 96 hours remaining before I had to stand before a judge and defend the lis pendens, my search through the family archives became frantic. I required concrete proof that the warranty deed was legally invalid, and I lacked the time to procure a forensic handwriting expert. I needed a structural flaw in the transaction itself. I descended the narrow wooden stairs into the damp, unfinished basement of my row house. The air down there always smells faintly of old river water and dust. The concrete floor was already covered in stacks of discarded tax returns and utility receipts. I was running purely on adrenaline and dark coffee, my visions swimming from exhaustion. I dragged a wobbly step stool over to the far wall, determined to pull down the final boxes stored on the highest shelf of the storage closet. These boxes contained Grandpa Henry's medical records from his final year's heavy stacks of hospital invoices and pharmacy printouts. I reached up, wrapping my hands around the base of the thickest cardboard box. As I pulled it forward, the weight shifted unevenly. The edge of the box clipped a metal object sitting precariously close to the edge of the shelf. My hand slipped. I lost my grip entirely. The heavy rusted fishing tackle box plummeted toward the ground. It struck the concrete floor with a deafening metallic crash. The rusted latch snapped open upon impact. Decades of accumulated fishing gear exploded across the damp basement. Tangled nylon lines led sinkers, and dozens of tarnished metal lures scattered into the dark corners of the room. A strong, pungent scent of stale Old Bay seasoning and old brass instantly filled the stale air, a scent I always associated tightly with my grandfather. I let out a ragged, frustrated sigh. I was exhausted, terrified of losing my home, and rapidly running out of time. Cleaning up a mess of tangled fishing hooks was the last thing I needed. I dropped to my knees on the cold concrete, carefully navigating the sharp debris. I began scooping the rusted spoons and cracked plastic bobbers back into the dented metal trays. As I lifted a particularly tangled cluster of weighted lines near the back corner of the spill, a small flash of color caught my eye. Wedged tightly beneath a heavy lead sinker was a small rectangular piece of paper. I pulled it free, brushing away a layer of fine dust. It was a faded piece of heavy cream-colored cardstock. I held it up to the dim basement lighting. It was a business card. The ink was slightly smudged, likely from years of sitting in the humid tackle box, but the text remained legible. The bold black lettering read, "Arthur Gable Estate Planning and Trusts." Below the name sat a phone number and a rural address located in a small town in northern Maryland near the Pennsylvania border. I sat back on my heels, the cold concrete seeping through my jeans. I stared at the card. Grandpa Henry was a simple man. He handled his meager finances through the local credit union and kept his important receipts in a shoebox under his bed. He despised lawyers and actively avoided formal legal proceedings. The idea of him traveling to a rural estate planner contradicted everything I knew about his habits. My mind raced backward, fighting through the exhaustion, trying to connect the disparate pieces of the puzzle. I thought about the sweltering Tuesday evening Thomas delivered the news of the sale. I thought about the timeline of the forged deed. Then the memory hit me with sudden, staggering clarity. I was back on the sagging front porch of the Harford County farmhouse months before he passed away. Grandpa sat in his rocking chair gripping this exact rusted tackle box. His hands were shaking from the tremors, but his voice carried a quiet, fierce determination. "I put a lock on the soil, Ellie," he had muttered, tracing the metal latch. "A lock no banker can pick." I had dismissed those words as the rambling of a failing mind. I assumed his dementia was fueling a paranoid delusion. Sitting in my damp basement holding the faded business card, the cryptic phrase took on a terrifying new meaning. Grandpa was not delusional. He was warning me. The business card was not a random piece of trash forgotten in a tackle box. It was a breadcrumb left behind by a man who knew his mind was failing and wanted to ensure his legacy survived his own deterioration. My pulse spiked, hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had been desperately searching for a way to prove the physical ink on the deed was a forgery. But if Grandpa Henry had visited an estate planner before he died, he might have initiated a legal maneuver that altered the ownership status of the farm prior to the fraudulent sale. If Arthur Gable possessed documents proving a change in title status, I would not need a forensic handwriting expert. I could prove the transaction itself was legally impossible. I was holding the key to the lock my grandfather had built. I shoved the business card into my pocket and scrambled up the wooden stairs, leaving the scattered fishing gear on the basement floor. I grabbed my laptop off the kitchen island. I needed to verify if Arthur Gable was still an active practicing attorney. The business card looked decades old. I navigated to the Maryland State Bar Directory. I typed the name into the search bar, holding my breath. The database loaded. Arthur Gable was listed as an active licensed attorney in good standing. His practice address matched the rural location printed on the faded card. I glanced at the digital clock on my screen. It was late Thursday evening. The expedited circuit court hearing was scheduled for Tuesday morning. The upcoming weekend meant I had exactly one business day remaining to secure the evidence required to halt the expungement of my lis pendens and save my Fells Point rowhouse from the fraudulent mechanic's lien. I set my alarm for dawn. I needed to drive to northern Maryland. I had to locate a semi-retired estate planner and uncover the legal barricade my grandfather had secretly constructed. I was acting on a desperate hunch, entirely unaware that the documents resting in Arthur Gable's archives would reveal a legal obstacle so immense my uncle had completely failed to anticipate its existence. The drive to northern Maryland the following morning felt like an agonizing crawl. Heavy rain lashed against my windshield as I navigated the winding two-lane county roads leading toward the Pennsylvania border. My knuckles ached from gripping the steering wheel. I possessed exactly one business day to secure the evidence required to halt the circuit court judge from expunging my lis pendens and triggering the foreclosure on my rowhouse. My entire survival rested on a faded business card I had found beneath a rusted fishing lure. The address led me away from the commercial districts and down a long gravel driveway flanked by ancient oak trees. Arthur Gable did not operate out of a sleek glass-walled corporate tower. His practice was housed in a converted white clapboard farmhouse. A modest wooden sign near the front porch swung gently in the wind. I parked my car and ran through the rain up the wooden steps. The interior of the office smelled strongly of dark roast coffee and aged paper. Stacks of manila folders leaned precariously on heavy oak filing cabinets. It felt less like a law firm and more like a municipal archive frozen in time. Mr. Gable emerged from a back room carrying a ceramic mug. He was a tall man with thinning silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses resting low on his nose. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had spent decades navigating sluggish probate courts. I introduced myself, my voice tight with urgency. I handed him the faded, yellowed business card I had retrieved from the tackle box. I explained that I was Henry Vance's granddaughter. A warm, genuine smile spread across Gable's weathered face. He remembered Grandpa Henry vividly. He gestured for me to sit in a worn leather chair across from his desk. He spoke fondly of my grandfather, recalling their lengthy conversations about soil conservation and local zoning ordinances. I did not have the luxury of engaging in nostalgic pleasantries. The ticking clock of the Tuesday morning hearing throbbed in my temples. I reached into my bag and pulled out the digital scan of the warranty deed my uncle had utilized to sell the Harford County farm to Apex Holdings. I slid the document across the desk. I explained the situation rapidly, detailing the quiet sale, the impending bulldozers, the SLAPP suit, and the glaring obvious forgery of my grandfather's signature. Gable picked up the document. His smile vanished, replaced by a deep, profound confusion. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the legal text and the notary stamp verifying the transfer. He did not look angry. He looked genuinely baffled. "This makes absolutely no sense," Gable muttered, tapping his pen against the paper. Henry could not have signed a standard warranty deed for that parcel of land 3 years ago. I leaned forward, my heart hammering. I asked him why the signature was legally impossible. I expected him to cite medical records or a documented timeline of my grandfather's physical decline. I assumed we were discussing the mechanics of the forged ink. Gable set the deed down. He stood up slowly from his chair without answering. He walked out of the office and descended a narrow set of stairs leading into his basement archives. I sat alone in the quiet office, listening to the rain hit the window panes. The heavy scent of old paper seemed to suffocate the room. My mind raced through the implications of his confusion. If my grandfather could not legally sign the deed, it meant a structural flaw existed in the transaction itself. I prayed the flaw was significant enough to withstand the scrutiny of a circuit court judge. Several agonizing minutes passed before Gable returned. He was carrying a thick, heavy leather binder. A layer of fine gray dust coated the cover. He dropped it onto the center of his oak desk with a heavy thud. He opened the binder and turned the thick pages until he found the specific section he was hunting for. He pushed the open binder toward me, rotating it so I could read the dense legal text. 5 years before his death, Gable explained, his voice low and serious. Henry came to this office. He was deeply concerned about the future of the Harford County farm. He knew his health was failing. He also knew your uncle was carrying a massive amount of medical debt regarding his wife's illness. Henry loved his son, but he did not trust him to manage the estate under financial duress. He feared the property would be quickly liquidated to satisfy creditors the moment he passed away. I stared at the pages in front of me. The header on the document read, "Revocable Living Trust Agreement." Gable pointed to the execution dates and the attached property schedules. Henry formally legally transferred the deed of the Harford County farm out of his personal name and directly into this trust. He did this specifically to avoid the messy delays of the probate court and to build a legal fortress around the land. The legal implication hit me with the force of a freight train. The magnitude of the obstacle my uncle had entirely failed to anticipate was staggering. When a property is transferred into a trust, the individual no longer owns the asset in their personal capacity. The trust becomes the legal entity holding the title. Therefore, if a sale occurs, the transaction must be executed by the designated trustee utilizing specific trust documents, not a standard personal warranty deed. By definition, Gable stated flatly, tapping the forged warranty deed I had brought him. Henry Arthur Vance, as an individual, could not sign this document because he did not own the property. This deed is not just fraudulent because the ink is faked. It is void ab initio. It is void from the very beginning. Your uncle forged the signature of a man who possessed zero legal capacity to sell the asset. I sat back in the leather chair, the air rushing out of my lungs. We had found the undeniable smoking gun. Thomas had orchestrated his quiet felony, assuming the property remained in Grandpa's personal name. He assumed a forged signature and a corrupt notary were sufficient to bypass standard probate procedures and secure the cash payout from the developers. He was entirely ignorant of the fact that Grandpa Henry had secretly locked the soil away in a legal vault years prior. This was the lock no banker could pick. I traced my fingers over the genuine, jagged signature my grandfather had placed on the trust documents 5 years ago. He had anticipated the desperation of his own son. He had foreseen the threat of predatory liquidation and proactively built a barricade to ensure the legacy survived his death. I possessed the concrete evidence required to walk into the circuit court hearing and permanently halt the expungement of my lis pendens. Apex Holdings could not argue their way out of a trust document. Their title was not merely disputed, it was legally non-existent. I asked Gable to provide me with certified notarized copies of the entire revocable living trust binder. I needed the official documents to submit to my attorney immediately. Gable agreed, moving toward his copy machine. However, as he fed the thick pages into the scanner, he paused. He turned back toward me, his expression grave. "Ellie," he warned quietly, handing me the freshly printed stack of papers. "Introducing this trust document in open court will accomplish your goal. It will invalidate the developer's deed. But you must understand the immediate collateral damage of this strategy." I stopped packing my bag, looking at the weary attorney. I asked him what he meant. "The moment you present this evidence to a judge," Gable explained, "the civil dispute escalates into a major criminal matter. You are not just proving a title defect. You are proving that your uncle orchestrated a multi-million-dollar fraudulent real estate transaction across state lines. The moment these documents enter the public record, the developer's title insurance underwriters will be legally obligated to notify the authorities. You will be exposing your uncle to mandatory federal prosecution for wire fraud." The heavy, dusty air of the farmhouse office felt suddenly suffocating. The victory I held in my hands carried a devastating price tag. I had found the silver bullet required to save my grandfather's farm and lift the terrifying $80,000 mechanic's lien threatening my own rowhouse. But firing that bullet meant initiating the chain reaction that would inevitably send my uncle to a federal penitentiary. I thanked Mr. Gable, took the certified copies, and walked back out into the driving rain. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, staring at the thick manila envelope resting on the passenger seat. I possessed the power to destroy the corporate empire threatening my family, but the path to justice required me to orchestrate the total destruction of my own blood. I had to decide if I was willing to pull the trigger. The drive down Interstate 83 felt like navigating through a gray tunnel. Rain battered my windshield. I kept the manila envelope resting on the passenger seat, glancing at it every few miles. The heavy cardstock inside held the power to save my rowhouse, protect my grandfather's legacy, and send my uncle to federal prison. I parked in a damp garage near the inner harbor and took the elevator up to David's office. He was sitting behind his cluttered desk, reviewing case files. I dropped the certified copies of the Revocable Living Trust directly onto the polished wood. I told him we had our silver bullet. David opened the folder. He read through the establishing clauses, tracking the dates and the property schedules. A low whistle escaped his lips. He spread the trust paperwork out next to the digital scan of the forged warranty deed. "You were right," he said, tracing the signature lines with the end of his pen. "Henry Vance transferred the parcel into this trust 5 years prior to his death. This means the warranty deed Thomas provided to the developers is void from inception. Your uncle signed a document he had no legal authority to execute. We discussed the immediate legal strategy. Submitting these documents at the upcoming circuit court hearing would halt the expungement of my notice of pending litigation. The judge would have to recognize the trust. The commercial development would remain paralyzed. But David reminded me of the harsh reality we faced. Presenting this evidence in open court meant initiating a criminal inquiry. Thomas would face federal wire fraud charges. I paced the length of the office, staring out the window at the harbor. Boats bobbed in the gray water. I thought about Thomas sitting in my kitchen, projecting that weary aura. I thought about the staggering medical debt he carried from his late wife's illness. I was weighing the moral cost of destroying my own blood to save a piece of land. While I stood by the glass, David continued to scrutinize the forged deed. He leaned closer to the document, adjusting his glasses. He focused not on the signature, but on the bottom corner of the page. "Ellie, come look at this," he said. His tone was tight, stripped of its usual cynical detachment. I walked back to the desk. He was pointing at the notary seal, Richard Calloway. We knew the name. We knew the stamp gave the fraudulent document its legal armor. We assumed Calloway was just a corrupt associate, someone Thomas knew from his old contracting days, who was willing to look the other way for a small fee. David turned to his dual monitors. He pulled up the Maryland State Licensing Database. "We need to look deeper at the notary," he explained. "If we are going into an evidentiary hearing accusing a party of forgery, we must establish the chain of custody. We need to know exactly who stamped this paper." He typed the commission number from the seal into the search bar. The database loaded, pulling up the official registration record. It listed Richard Calloway as an active notary public. But David did not stop there. He cross-referenced the listed business address with state corporate filings and employment histories. The screen refreshed, displaying a professional profile. I stared at the digital text, my breath catching in my throat. Richard Calloway was not an independent contractor running a shady side business. His employment profile listed his current active title. He was a senior title coordinator directly employed by Apex Holdings. The air in the room grew heavy and still. The implications of that single line of text fundamentally altered the reality of our situation. I looked at David. He sat back in his chair, taking a slow, deep breath. They knew, David stated quietly. The pieces of the puzzle snapped together, revealing a picture far more sinister than a simple family betrayal. Up until this second, I believed Apex Holdings was a neutral third-party buyer. I assumed they were a legitimate corporate entity that had simply purchased land from a desperate man, unaware that the signature on the closing documents was faked. I thought they were defending their title so fiercely because they were trying to protect a blind investment. The truth was entirely different. Apex Holdings did not get duped. They orchestrated the theft. Thomas was a man drowning in predatory medical loans. His wife had required expensive experimental treatments for early-onset Alzheimer's disease. He had drained his retirement accounts and ruined his credit score trying to keep her comfortable. He was terrified, grieving, and financially cornered. The developers at Apex recognized a vulnerable target. They identified the prime Harford County acreage they needed for their subdivision, but they knew Grandpa Henry would never sell. When Grandpa passed away, they approached Thomas. They preyed on his desperation. They offered him a quiet, off-the-record cash buyout to satisfy his crushing debts. Thomas knew he did not hold the legal authority to sell the farm. He knew his father's signature was required on the deed, but the developers did not care. They needed the 70 acres to complete their commercial portfolio. They provided the solution to his hesitation. They supplied their own internal notary, Richard Calloway, to rubber stamp the felony. Apex Holdings actively facilitated the forgery. They provided the legal armor necessary to push the fraudulent deed through the county records office. They bypassed standard municipal safeguards, utilizing their corporate resources to steal the land for pennies on the dollar. My uncle was not a criminal mastermind who pulled the wool over the eyes of a billionaire developer. He was a pawn in a sophisticated corporate conspiracy. The outrage I felt toward Thomas began to shift, morphing into a cold, terrifying clarity regarding the enemy I was actually fighting. The developers had filed a predatory lawsuit against me. They had threatened me with defamation. They had subpoenaed me for a grueling deposition, sitting across a mahogany table and painting me as an unstable, greedy relative. They did all of this knowing they were complicit in a felony. They acted invincible because they assumed the internal mechanisms of their fraud would remain buried. They calculated that a city preservation coordinator lacked the resources to uncover a corporate cover-up. "We hold the smoking gun," David said, breaking the quiet tension in the office. "This changes our entire strategy. We are no longer just fighting to prove a title defect. We possess the evidence to prove civil conspiracy and corporate fraud." He laid out the new legal landscape. Presenting the revocable living trust and the notary employment records to the circuit court judge would not just halt the demolition of the stone smokehouse, it would trigger an immediate referral to the state attorney general. The developers would face a sprawling federal investigation. Their corporate officers would be subjected to criminal subpoenas. However, David offered a sobering caveat. The evidence was bulletproof, but utilizing it still required Thomas to fall on his sword. Thomas was the central link. For the corporate conspiracy to be fully exposed, my uncle had to confirm their involvement. He had to testify under oath that Apex Holdings supplied the notary and knowingly accepted the forged deed. If Thomas refused to cooperate, if he invoked his right against self-incrimination, the developers could try to isolate the blame. They could claim the notary went rogue. They could spin a narrative protecting the executives while sacrificing lower-level employees. To dismantle the empire, I needed Thomas to publicly confess. I gathered the certified documents from the desk and placed them back into the manila envelope. I had spent weeks feeling outgunned and overwhelmed by the immense legal machinery deployed against me. I had maxed out credit cards and faced the terrifying prospect of losing my Fells Point rowhouse to a fraudulent mechanic lien. I had endured humiliating depositions and bitter fights with my own sister. Now the power dynamic was inverted. I held the exact tool required to bring a billionaire real estate developer to their knees. But securing that victory required a direct, brutal confrontation with the man who started it all. I left David's office and walked back to my car. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle. I did not drive home to the city. I pointed my vehicle toward the suburbs. I needed to look my uncle in the eye. I needed to lay the evidence on his coffee table and force him to understand that his quiet, desperate crime had ensnared him in a trap he could no longer escape. I was about to deliver an ultimatum that would require him to choose between protecting a corrupt corporation or saving whatever remained of his family. The drive to the suburbs felt heavy. The relentless rain from earlier in the day had stopped leaving behind a thick, suffocating humidity that clung to the windshield. I pulled my car onto the cracked asphalt of Thomas's driveway. His small, single-story house looked worn down, the paint peeling around the window frames, the gutters sagging under the weight of wet leaves. I did not invite him to meet at a neutral diner or a public coffee shop. I needed him cornered in his own space, stripped of the ability to casually walk away. I grabbed the manila envelope containing the certified trust documents and the corporate employment records from my passenger seat. I walked up the front steps and rang the doorbell. I waited a full minute before hearing the shuffling of feet inside. When Thomas opened the door, he looked startled. He was wearing faded sweatpants and a worn flannel shirt. The confident, weary patriarch routine he usually projected faltered instantly. "Ellie," he said, his voice hesitant. "What are you doing here? We should not be talking without the lawyers." I did not ask for permission to enter. I pushed past him into the dim, cluttered living room. The space smelled of stale tobacco and old fabric. Piles of unopened mail covered the dining table. Framed photographs of Aunt Claire lined the fireplace mantel, capturing a time before the medical debt consumed their lives. I walked straight to the center of the room. I opened the manila envelope and pulled out the heavy stack of certified papers. I dropped them directly onto his scarred wooden coffee table. The sharp slap of the paper hitting the wood echoed in the quiet room. I didn't yell. I didn't pace the room, throwing dramatic accusations. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting at my sides. The time for emotional screaming matches had ended when he decided to strap an $80,000 fraudulent mechanic's lien to my primary residence. "Sit down, Thomas," I said. My voice was low and calm, the kind of calm that signals the end of a negotiation. He looked at the papers, then at me. He slowly sank into a frayed armchair, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked defeated before the conversation even began. I walked him through the evidence methodically. I explained that Grandpa Henry had outsmarted him. I detailed the mechanics of the Revocable Living Trust, highlighting the execution dates that proved my grandfather had secretly locked the Harford County farm into a legal fortress 5 years prior to his death. I watched his face as the realization settled in. Thomas had orchestrated a quiet felony, assuming the property remained in his father's personal name. He thought a simple forged signature was sufficient to secure his payout from the developers. Hearing that he had forged the signature of a man who possessed zero legal capacity to sell the asset drained the color from his cheeks. He rubbed his face with both hands, letting out a long, ragged sigh. "You don't understand the pressure, Ellie," he muttered. "The medical bills, the facility in Towson for your mother. I was drowning. The developers approached me with a cash offer. They said they could make the paperwork disappear. I didn't offer sympathy. I pointed to the second document resting on the table, the state licensing record for the notary, Richard Calloway. "I know they approached you, Thomas," I replied. "I know they recognized a desperate man and offered him a way out. I know they provided their own internal notary to rubber stamp your forgery. They didn't just buy a stolen farm, they facilitated the theft." Thomas stared at the notary record. He blinked slowly, processing the fact that the corporate entity he partnered with was fully complicit in the crime. He realized the developers had not just played the system, they had played him. They insulated their corporate executives by letting a desperate, grieving husband execute the felony, assuming he would absorb the fallout if the transaction was ever questioned. I laid out the brutal reality of his situation. I explained that the expedited civil court hearing scheduled by Apex Holdings was no longer a simple dispute over a lis pendens. I told him that the moment my attorney presented the certified trust and the notary employment records to the judge, the civil proceeding would instantly escalate. The judge is legally obligated to refer this to the Maryland Attorney General, I stated, maintaining eye contact. The state prosecutors will initiate a federal investigation into wire fraud and real estate conspiracy. The moment these documents enter the public record, you are facing a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. The defensive, weary facade he had maintained for months finally shattered completely. The weight of his impending incarceration crushed him. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. He began to weep. It was a pathetic, gut-wrenching display. His broad shoulders shook violently as loud, ragged sobs tore from his chest. He was a man recognizing the total, inescapable collapse of his life. I watched him cry. I thought about the $80,000 lien anchoring my Fells Point rowhouse, threatening to leave me homeless. I thought about the humiliating deposition where he weaponized his grief to paint me as an unstable, greedy relative on the official record. The urge to offer comfort was entirely absent. When his sobbing subsided into uneven gasps, I delivered my ultimatum. I did not offer him a way out of the consequences. I offered him a choice regarding the severity of his punishment. I told him I held the power to push the prosecutors for maximum federal sentencing. I could ensure he faced the harshest possible penalties for defrauding the estate and anchoring a fraudulent loan to my name, or he could cooperate. The only way I do not advocate for maximum sentencing, I said, my tone flat and unyielding, is, if you take the stand at the evidentiary hearing on Tuesday. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and swollen. You want me to testify? I want you to confess, I corrected him. You are going to sit in that witness box under oath. You are going to publicly state that you forged the warranty deed. And then you are going to testify that Apex Holdings supplied the notary and orchestrated the transaction. You are going to throw the billion-dollar developer under the bus. Thomas hesitated. The prospect of confessing to a felony in open court terrified him, but the alternative was a guaranteed lengthy federal prison sentence. He was trapped by his own desperate choices. He had tried to cheat the system to save himself from bankruptcy, and now he was forced to choose between destroying his own freedom or destroying the corporate empire that facilitated his crime. He looked down at his coffee table, staring at the certified trust documents. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. I gathered the papers and slid them back into the manila envelope. I did not say goodbye. I walked out of the dim living room and back to my car. I had secured the testimony required to dismantle the corporate developers and invalidate the forged deed. I possessed the evidence to clear the fraudulent mechanic's lien from my property. However, relying on a desperate man to confess in a high-stakes courtroom setting is an inherently volatile strategy. I assumed the upcoming hearing would proceed according to our calculated plan. I anticipated that Thomas would take the stand, deliver his confession, and trigger the federal investigation against Apex Holdings. I was unprepared for the chaotic reality of the courtroom. As we walked through the metal detectors of the Harford County Circuit Court the following Tuesday, a heavy, oppressive rain began to fall. The sterile, judicial environment would not offer a clean, cinematic victory. The developers were about to deploy a desperate, aggressive countermeasure to suppress the testimony, forcing me to navigate a brutal cross-examination before Thomas ever had the chance to speak. The true battle was about to erupt on the official record testing whether the truth could survive the relentless machinery of corporate litigation. The heavy oak doors of the Harford County Circuit Court swung shut behind me, sealing out the relentless morning rain. The courtroom inside was stark and aggressively brightly lit, smelling of damp wool and industrial floor cleaner. There were no soaring architectural arches or dramatic mahogany carvings. It was a functional utilitarian space designed for processing civic disputes with ruthless efficiency. I took my seat next to David at the defense table. My pulse hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. Across the aisle, the legal team representing Apex Holdings unpacked their sleek leather briefcases. They moved with a relaxed, arrogant confidence. The lead litigator, the same man who had dismantled my composure during the deposition, adjusted his silk tie and smiled at a junior associate. They clearly expected to dispatch my case before the morning recess. Judge Collins entered the room with a sharp, impatient stride. She was a stern woman nearing retirement, known for her zero-tolerance policy regarding frivolous commercial delays. She scanned the packed morning docket on her bench, her expression signaling a clear desire to quickly grant Apex's motion and expunge my lis pendens. She viewed this hearing as a minor administrative hurdle, assuming I was simply another disgruntled relative stalling a legitimate development. The proceedings began precisely at 9. Apex's lead counsel stood up and launched into a polished, persuasive opening statement. He characterized my filing as a malicious bad faith tactic. He referenced my emotional outburst during the deposition, painting me as an unstable individual, leveraging historic preservation codes to extort a generous corporate settlement. He demanded the immediate removal of the cloud on their title so they could commence bulldozing the stone smokehouse and begin their subdivision. When he sat down, Judge Collins turned her sharp gaze toward our table. She instructed David to present his counterargument, her tone suggesting he better make it brief. David stood up slowly. He did not deliver a passionate speech about family legacies or predatory developers. He operated with cold, mechanical precision. He approached the bench and requested permission to enter a new exhibit into the official record. "I have a certified document retrieved from the archives of attorney Arthur Gable," David stated firmly. "It is the revocable living trust agreement executed by Henry Arthur Vance 5 years prior to his death." The atmosphere in the sterile courtroom shifted with the sudden intensity of a plunging barometer. The arrogant confidence radiating from the apex table evaporated instantly. The lead litigator leaned forward, his posture rigid. David handed copies of the heavy binder to the judge and to the opposing counsel. Judge Collins put on her reading glasses, her annoyance fading into intense scrutiny as she reviewed the execution dates and the attached property schedules. David laid out the devastating legal reality. He explained that by legally transferring the Harford County farm into the trust, Henry Vance removed the asset from his personal estate. He detailed the irrefutable conclusion the warranty deed Apex Holdings possessed was void from its inception. The signature on their closing documents, regardless of who penned it, belonged to a man who possessed zero legal capacity to sell the property. I watched the Apex litigator flip through the certified pages. The color drained completely from his face. His carefully constructed narrative of a legitimate real estate transaction was obliterated. He realized their multi-million-dollar title insurance policy, underwritten by a major national bank, was entirely compromised. They were holding a worthless piece of paper. The litigator scrambled to his feet, attempting a desperate countermeasure. He aggressively objected to the introduction of the trust, citing procedural timing and questioning the authenticity of the dusty binder. He tried to argue that Thomas Vance possessed a valid power of attorney that superseded the trust documents. It was a chaotic, panicked attempt to suppress the evidence. Judge Collins silenced him with a sharp wave of her hand. She recognized the undeniable authority of a certified living trust. The structural flaw in the transaction was glaringly obvious. The legal foundation of Apex's claim had collapsed. However, proving the deed was void did not automatically expose the corporate conspiracy. The trust document invalidated the sale, but it did not prove Apex actively participated in a felony. To trigger the federal investigation and ensure the developer lost their commercial licenses, I needed the smoking gun. I needed Thomas. David called Thomas Vance to the stand. My uncle walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. His shoulders were slumped, his gait slow and heavy. He looked like a man walking toward a firing squad. He took the oath and sat in the witness box. The microphone amplified his shallow, ragged breathing. David began the questioning. He did not attack Thomas. He guided him methodically through the timeline of events. He asked about the mounting medical debts from Aunt Claire's illness. He asked about the quiet negotiations with the developer. Then David produced the digital scan of the forged warranty deed and the state licensing record for the notary, Richard Calloway. He presented them to Thomas. "Mr. Vance," David asked, his voice echoing in the quiet courtroom, "did your father, Henry Vance, sign this warranty deed?" Thomas stared down at the documents resting on the ledge of the witness box. He hesitated. his hands trembling visibly. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. The apex litigator sat frozen at his table, recognizing the impending disaster. "No," Thomas finally answered. His voice cracked barely a whisper. "My father did not sign it." David pressed forward, demanding clarity for the official record. "Who signed the document?" "Mr. Vance, I did," Thomas confessed. "I forged his signature." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Collins leaned forward, her expression hardening into absolute severity. Admitting to real estate forgery under oath in open court is a staggering escalation. David did not pause to let the admission settle. He delivered the final critical question. Mr. Vance, who provided the notary stamp to verify the fraudulent signature, Thomas looked up. He did not look at me or at the judge. He looked directly at the lead litigator for Apex Holdings. "The developers brought him?" Thomas testified, his voice gaining a desperate hollow strength. "They knew I didn't have the authority to sell. They knew my father was sick. They told me they could handle the paperwork quietly if I agreed to a reduced cash payout. They sent their own title coordinator, Richard Calloway, to my house to stamp the document after I signed it. They orchestrated the entire thing." The courtroom erupted into chaos. The apex litigator shouted objections, frantically trying to strike the testimony from the record, claiming Thomas was a hostile, unreliable witness offering hearsay. It was a grueling, agonizing scene. Thomas was destroying his own reputation in real time, confessing to a felony to save himself from maximum federal sentencing, and simultaneously detonating a bomb under a billion-dollar corporate empire. He threw the developers under the bus, exposing their predatory practices and their complicity in real estate fraud. Judge Collins slammed her gavel against the sounding block. The sharp, deafening crack cut through the shouting attorneys. "Order in this court," she commanded, her voice radiating absolute authority. She looked down at the forged warranty deed, then at Thomas, and finally at the pale, sweating legal team representing Apex Holdings. She did not issue a routine ruling. She recognized she was presiding over a sprawling criminal conspiracy. Given the sworn testimony presented today, Judge Collins announced, her tone icy and resolute. "I find the warranty deed transferring the Harford County property to Apex Holdings to be fraudulent and void ab initio. The motion to expunge the lis pendens is denied with prejudice." She turned to the court bailiff standing near the door. "Contact the Maryland State's Attorney's Office immediately. I am halting all civil proceedings regarding this matter and referring the entire docket for criminal investigation based on confessed felony forgery and corporate wire fraud." The gavel dropped a second time. It was the sound of a corporate empire fracturing. I sat back in my chair, a profound, dizzying sense of relief washing over me. We had won the evidentiary hearing. The Harford County farm was legally severed from the developer. The stone smokehouse was safe from the bulldozers. Thomas had delivered the confession required to trigger the federal investigation, ensuring Apex Holdings would face devastating consequences for their complicity. I expected the victory to feel clean and triumphant. I assumed the validation of my grandfather's trust would immediately resolve the crushing pressure I had endured for months. I was naive regarding the brutal systemic aftermath of exposing massive corporate fraud. Winning the hearing invalidated the developer's deed, but it did not magically erase the $80,000 fraudulent mechanics lien Thomas had strapped to my Fells Point rowhouse. That debt belonged to a separate medical collection agency entirely disconnected from the real estate dispute. Exposing Thomas's felony on the public record guaranteed that his assets would be instantly frozen by the state prosecutors. By forcing my uncle to confess, I had successfully destroyed the developer, but I had also triggered the exact financial mechanism I feared most. The bank holding the fraudulent medical loan was about to be notified of the criminal investigation. The devastating audit was imminent. I had won the battle for the farm, but the war for my own home was about to escalate into a terrifying bureaucratic nightmare, forcing me to navigate a labyrinth of corporate liability that threatened to bankrupt me before I could ever claim my grandfather's legacy. The sharp crack of Judge Collins's gavel echoing in the Harford County courtroom initiated a shockwave that rapidly destabilized a billionaire corporate empire. Invalidating the warranty deed and saving the stone smokehouse were merely the preliminary victories in a much larger war. I was not content with simply halting the bulldozers. Apex Holdings had subjected me to a predatory SLAPP suit, attempted to ruin my professional credibility, and actively facilitated a felony to steal my grandfather's legacy. They required a definitive structural dismantling. David and I did not wait for the sluggish Maryland state's attorney to organize their federal wire fraud investigation. We possessed the sworn court transcripts containing Thomas's confession, along with the official employment records proving the fraudulent notary, Richard Calloway, was a senior title coordinator directly on the developer's payroll. We compiled this undeniable evidence into a comprehensive dossier. I utilized my deep familiarity with municipal regulatory frameworks as a city preservation coordinator. I did not send the dossier to a standard consumer complaint hotline. I forwarded the explosive package directly to the Executive Board of the Maryland Real Estate Commission, the State Licensing Authority, and the Chesapeake Bay Critical Area Commission. The regulatory retaliation was swift and merciless. Municipal boards despise being manipulated by deep-pocketed developers who assume they operate above the law. The evidence of a corporate entity providing internal personnel to rubber stamp, forged closing documents on environmentally sensitive acreage, triggered an immediate, devastating administrative response. Within 48 hours of receiving the dossier, the Maryland Real Estate Commission formally suspended Apex Holdings' commercial developer license pending a full regulatory hearing. Harford County revoked all active building permits associated with the company across the entire district. The immediate loss of licensing paralyzed their active construction sites statewide. The financial hemorrhage was catastrophic. Subcontractors halted work suppliers, demanded immediate payment, and institutional investors aggressively pulled their funding due to the sudden severe compliance risks. By exposing the corrupt internal mechanics of their operation, I did not just save a single 70-acre farm. I effectively detonated their regional business model. The corporation lost billions in projected revenue and forfeited their eligibility for future lucrative municipal contracts. The predatory giant that had threatened to bankrupt me was reduced to scrambling for survival amid a chaotic flurry of emergency board meetings and plummeting stock valuations. The corporate collapse provided a profound sense of vindication, but the victory did not instantly erase the crushing personal terror I carried. Apex was crippled, but the $80,000 fraudulent mechanics lien remained anchored to the deed of my Fells Point rowhouse. My credit score was still decimated, and the threat of the medical debt collection agency initiating a forced sheriff's sale lingered like a dark cloud over my daily life. The resolution of my uncle's criminal liability and the subsequent untangling of my personal financial ruin moved with agonizing bureaucratic slowness. Thomas faced a brutal reality. The Maryland state's attorney formally indicted him on charges of real estate forgery and wire fraud. He was staring down the very real prospect of spending his remaining years in a federal penitentiary. However, his decision to testify against Apex Holdings provided his defense attorney with crucial leverage. State prosecutors value cooperative witnesses who can deliver the necessary testimony to dismantle larger systemic corporate corruption. After months of grueling closed-door negotiations, Thomas formally accepted a highly restrictive plea agreement. The prosecutors agreed to suspend the federal prison sentence in exchange for his full cooperation in the ongoing investigation into Apex Holdings' executive board. He pleaded guilty to state-level felony fraud charges. Avoiding incarceration, however, did not mean avoiding severe consequences. The judge presiding over the criminal case mandated full immediate financial restitution as a strict condition of his suspended sentence. Thomas was legally compelled to correct the financial devastation he had inflicted upon me. He was forced to aggressively liquidate his remaining assets. He sold his modest suburban home, drained his diminished retirement accounts, and auctioned off his late wife's remaining jewelry. It was a bleak, humiliating process of dismantling his life piece by piece to satisfy the court order. The funds he generated were not handed to me directly. The court utilized the liquidated assets to formally satisfy the $80,000 defaulted medical bridge loan he had fraudulently secured using my forged signature. The payment cleared the debt entirely. The day the official notice arrived from the Maryland Department of Assessments and Taxation confirming the release of the mechanic's lien on my rowhouse, I sat at my kitchen island and cried. The tears were not born of grief or anger, but of a profound, overwhelming exhaustion. The suffocating weight that had crushed my chest for months finally dissipated. I no longer had to fear losing my home. My credit report was slowly beginning the arduous process of repairing the damage inflicted by the fraudulent default. The heavy, messy truth had permanently altered the trajectory of our lives, but the debt was finally cleared. However, resolving the legal and financial crisis did not magically heal the deep, jagged fractures running through our family. The revelation of Thomas's crimes and the subsequent corporate scandal generated a toxic atmosphere of whispers and strained loyalties among the extended relatives. I had protected my grandfather's legacy, but the cost of that preservation required navigating a complex landscape of emotional fallout that no court order could simplify. I was about to discover that setting the record straight often means accepting that the relationships you fought to protect may never look the same again. The release of the mechanic's lien lifted the terrifying threat of foreclosure from my Fells Point rowhouse, but the silence that followed the legal victory was heavy and complex. Exposing a felony committed by your own blood does not result in a cinematic celebration. It leaves behind a sprawling landscape of emotional wreckage. You cannot sever a rotten branch without the entire tree feeling the shock. The fallout fractured our family deeply. Sarah and I spent months navigating a tense, delicate reconciliation. When the details of the court proceedings became public, she finally understood the depth of Thomas's manipulation. She realized he had weaponized our mother's fragile health and the funding for the Towson assisted living facility to secure her loyalty and turn us against each other. She eventually forgave me for the bitter argument in my kitchen and the shattered coffee mugs, but the damage to our family dynamic was permanent. Our subsequent holiday gatherings were no longer loud, chaotic affairs filled with laughter. They became stiff, carefully choreographed events, burdened by unspoken grief. We avoided mentioning the Harford County farm or the criminal trial tip towing around the elephant in the room to maintain a fragile peace. If you have ever been forced to enforce a rigid boundary that alienated people you genuinely loved, you understand that setting the record straight rarely feels triumphant. It feels like surviving a grueling endurance test. You walk away with your integrity intact, but you carry the scars of the relationships you had to sacrifice along the way. While Sarah and I slowly rebuilt our sisterly bond, Thomas faced a starkly different reality. The Maryland judicial system finalized his sentencing, delivering a profound, unyielding measure of poetic justice that mirrored the exact fears that drove him to commit the crimes. Thomas had avoided federal prison by testifying against Apex Holdings, but the state court judge presiding over his felony fraud conviction did not let him walk away unscathed. As a strict condition of his 5-year probationary period, the judge mandated 3,000 hours of court-supervised community service. The assignment was not a comfortable administrative role, filing paperwork at a local charity. The probation office directed Thomas to fulfill his hours working as an orderly in a severely underfunded, low-income state-run medical facility located on the outskirts of Baltimore. This was the exact grim institutional environment Thomas had been so terrified of when his late wife Aunt Claire required specialized care. His entire criminal trajectory, forging my signature on the predatory bridge loan and falsifying the warranty deed for the farm, was fueled by his desperate, panicked desire to keep his family out of the harsh reality of the public healthcare system. He believed his status and his frantic maneuvering could shield him from the systemic failures of state-run medical care. Now he was legally tethered to it. The man who had orchestrated a multi-million-dollar real estate felony to bypass the financial burdens of illness was forced to clock in at dawn to mop linoleum floors, change soiled linens, and assist overworked nurses in overcrowded wards. He was stripped of his pride and his perceived control, forced to confront the brutal, exhausting reality of the healthcare infrastructure he had tried so desperately to cheat. He was trapped day after day in the precise environment he broke the law to avoid. It was a harsh, grueling rehabilitation process that offered no shortcuts or loopholes. I visited Thomas only once after his sentencing. I drove to the state facility on a cold, overcast Tuesday afternoon. I sat across from him in a sterile cafeteria smelling of strong bleach and boiled vegetables. He looked drastically aged, the heavy lines on his face reflecting the physical toll of his mandatory service hours. Our conversation was brief and painfully strained. He offered a stilted apology, primarily focusing on the stress he caused by attaching the fraudulent lien to my home. He struggled to look me in the eye when discussing Grandpa Henry or the stolen acreage. I accepted his apology quietly, but I made it unmistakably clear that our relationship was permanently severed. I wished him well, and his rehabilitation stood up and walked out of the cafeteria. I left the facility feeling a profound, heavy sorrow rather than vindication. Seeing him reduced to such a fragile state did not spark joy. It merely confirmed the tragic, wasteful nature of his choices. I had protected my grandfather's legacy and saved my own home, but the cost was a permanent void where an uncle used to be. The legal and emotional debris of the corporate conspiracy had finally settled. The developers were stripped of their licensing, the fraudulent debt was cleared, and Thomas was serving his sentence. The path was finally clear for me to focus on the land that started the entire war. The Harford County farm was officially returning to my control, and I was about to discover that protecting the soil from bulldozers was only the first step in honoring the promise I made to my grandfather. The true challenge lay in securing the property's future against any remaining threats requiring me to utilize my professional expertise to build an impenetrable legal fortress of my own. I am standing on the damp, muddy soil of my grandfather's farm in Harford County. The crisp autumn wind bites at my canvas jacket, carrying the sharp scent of drying corn stalks and wet earth. The towering yellow bulldozers that once threatened to level this land are long gone, replaced by the quiet, enduring stillness of the Maryland countryside. Near the edge of the property, the 100-year-old stone smokehouse stands resilient. It survived the corporate siege, but the ordeal left physical scars on the structure. My very first act as the newly recognized successor trustee was to hire a local veteran mason to repair the damage. I watched him work for hours, meticulously scraping away the decaying mortar and carefully replacing the cracked cornerstone of the foundation. It was a slow, deliberate process of restoration. The repaired smokehouse stands tall at the front of the property, a physical symbol of the history we refuse to let them erase. Securing the legal title was only the beginning of my responsibility. I utilized my professional background as a city preservation coordinator to navigate the dense bureaucracy of the Maryland Department of Agriculture. After months of submitting rigorous soil assessments and endless zoning applications, I secured a state agricultural preservation grant. This legal mechanism placed a strict conservation easement directly onto the deed. The land is now permanently bound against any future commercial development. No corporate entity can ever pave over these fields to build a subdivision. With the land protected, I leased the arable acreage to a young farming cooperative. They are a dedicated group focused on sustainable agriculture, growing heirloom tomatoes and sweet corn. The lease generates a steady, reliable revenue stream, which I use to maintain the property taxes and fund the exorbitant monthly invoices for my mother's assisted living facility in Towson. However, the financial reality of elder care is an ongoing heavy burden. The cooperative lease covers the baseline costs, but the facility recently announced a steep increase in their specialized memory care rates. The rising invoices created a quiet, persistent anxiety in the back of my mind. I spent my evenings calculating budgets, wondering if I would eventually have to subdivide a minor non-historic parcel of the land just to keep my mother in her safe environment. The threat of financial strain had not vanished entirely. It had merely evolved into a slow, grinding pressure. I was reviewing a stack of dense medical invoices near the smokehouse when the mason called out to me. He had removed the heavy, damaged cornerstone to lay down a fresh bed of mortar, exposing the deep, hollow cavity of the original 19th century foundation. He pointed into the dark recess of the stone wall. Resting at the very bottom of the cavity, hidden from the world for decades, was a heavy wax-sealed iron lockbox. I knelt in the damp mud and pulled the box free. The iron was cold and surprisingly heavy. I broke the brittle wax seal and forced the rusted hinges open. I expected to find old silver coins, or perhaps forgotten property deeds. Instead, the box contained a collection of fragile, yellowed ledgers bound in cracked leather alongside several detailed hand-drawn maps created by Grandpa Henry decades ago. I carefully opened the oldest ledger. The pages were filled with meticulously recorded dates, names, and transit routes dating back to the 1850s. I cross-referenced the maps Grandpa Henry had drawn. They charted a hidden network of subterranean root cellars and concealed wagon paths crisscrossing the Harford County acreage, converging directly beneath the stone smokehouse. The historical implication hit me with staggering force. The stone smokehouse was not just a structure used for curing meat. The ledgers provided undeniable primary source documentation that the farm had served as a highly active, crucial safe house on the Underground Railroad. It was a vital transit point for abolitionists guiding escaped slaves across the Maryland border into Pennsylvania. Grandpa Henry knew the profound historical truth of his land. He had spent his life quietly collecting and verifying the artifacts, keeping the secret buried in the foundation to protect the site from treasure hunters and amateur scavengers. He was waiting for the right moment to secure proper federal protection, knowing that a simple county deed was never enough to ward off predators. This was the true lock on the soil he had warned me about. I took an immediate, unyielding offensive. I bypassed the local municipal boards and submitted the ledgers and maps directly to the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior. The federal response was unprecedented in its speed. Within weeks, the Harford County farm was officially designated as a National Historic Landmark, granting it the highest level of federal heritage protection available in the country. The prestigious federal designation triggered a spectacular, devastating legal backlash against the remnants of Apex Holdings. During their brief, unauthorized occupation of the farm, the developers had directed their bulldozers to aggressively grade the soil and clear brush around the smokehouse to prepare for their planned subdivision. Because they had initiated unpermitted land clearing on what was now a federally recognized protected archaeological heritage site, the Environmental Protection Agency and the Federal Historic Preservation Commission levied staggering, insurmountable heritage destruction fines against the corporation. The developer's liability insurance refused to cover federal criminal negligence. To satisfy the exorbitant federal penalties, the court mandated that Apex Holdings pay direct punitive financial restitution to the estate to repair the topsoil and fund the archaeological preservation of the site. A certified check arrived from the federal court a month later. The sheer magnitude of the restitution payout was breathtaking. It was more than enough to establish an untouchable permanent endowment for the farm. I deposited the funds into a secure care trust. The specialized medical invoices for the Towson facility were paid in full, guaranteeing my mother the highest quality of care for the rest of her natural life without ever touching my public sector salary. Apex Holdings had tried to bury our legacy, and in doing so, they triggered the exact federal mechanism that bankrupted their remaining assets and permanently secured our family's future. Grandpa Henry had outsmarted the billionaires from beyond the grave. I stand in the middle of the sprawling green fields watching the young farmers harvest the late autumn crops. The air is sharp and clean. The journey to reach this quiet afternoon required navigating a labyrinth of profound betrayal. Uncovering the truth cost me the relationship with my uncle, deeply strained the bond with my sister, and pushed me to the very edge of personal ruin. Doing the right thing rarely results in a perfect, painless outcome. You do not walk away from a family war unscathed. Protecting your roots requires enduring intense psychological and financial collateral damage. You cannot always heal the people who hurt you. You cannot fix a relative who chooses to weaponize your identity to shield their own poor decisions. You are never obligated to drown with them just because you share a last name. We are responsible only for the boundaries we enforce. We are responsible for the soil we choose to cultivate and the history we refuse to surrender. The scars left behind by the conflict do not diminish the victory. They are the enduring proof that we stood our ground. I look back at the stone smokehouse, its new cornerstone resting firmly in the mortar, holding the weight of the past and the promise of tomorrow. The lock on the soil holds firm, and the truth remains exactly where it belongs, safe beneath the Maryland sky. From the quiet vantage point of a spiritual practitioner observing the turbulent, fast-paced currents of modern American society, the story of Ellie Thomas and Grandpa Henry offers a profound reflection. In our culture, we are consistently bombarded by the pressure to accumulate, to build bigger, and to pave over the old, to make way for the new. We measure a family's success by the size of their estate, the prestige of their zip code, and the seamless perfection they project to the world. We hide our fractures behind manicured lawns and curated holiday photographs, pretending that material comfort equates to spiritual peace. Yet this narrative strips away that illusion. It holds up a mirror to the quiet wars fought inside our own homes, offering a vital roadmap for true spiritual cultivation. This is especially true for parents who are raising the next generation in an era defined by anxiety, instant gratification, and shifting moral landscapes. If we look beneath the legal battles and corporate conspiracies of Ellie's journey, we find a masterclass in parenting values, resilience, and the true meaning of legacy. Here are the core messages American parents must absorb from this story. First, we must teach our children that true legacy is rooted in truth, not just wealth. In America, parents often stress over leaving behind financial safety nets, funding 529 college plans, securing property, or building trusts, believing that if we eliminate our children's financial struggles, we have succeeded as providers. We lay awake at night calculating interest rates, terrified our kids will fall behind in an unforgiving economy. But Grandpa Henry understood the human soul. He did not merely leave Ellie a piece of land. He left her a moral fortress. He preserved the history of the Underground Railroad beneath the smokehouse, knowing that the spiritual weight of that truth was far more valuable than any commercial payout. The message for parents is clear: do not simply leave your children money. Money without a moral compass breeds entitlement or worse, corruption. Teach your children to revere history, to value integrity, and to understand that dirt is the only thing that outlasts a lie. Raise them to be stewards of the truth, not just consumers of convenience. Show them that honesty and fairness are the true inheritance that will sustain them when the bank accounts run dry. Second, we must recognize the spiritual danger of fear-based survival. Uncle Thomas is a tragic reflection of a very real modern American terror, the fear of medical bankruptcy and financial ruin. We live in a society where a single illness can wipe out a lifetime of labor. Thomas was driven to commit a felony not out of pure malice, but out of a desperate, suffocating panic to save his wife and mother. However, from a spiritual perspective, fear is the ultimate corruptor. When we allow terror to dictate our actions, we compromise our souls, justifying betrayal in the name of survival. As parents, we accidentally pass this panic down to our children when we obsess over status and security at the expense of character. We must teach our children that morality is not a luxury reserved for comfortable times. It is the anchor we cling to during the storm. We must cultivate inner resilience and emotional awareness in our kids so that when life pushes them to the brink, they do not sell their integrity for a quick, deceitful lifeline. They must learn that true safety comes from living an authentic life, not a heavily financed lie. Third, we must redefine the concept of family loyalty through the lens of healthy boundaries. Society often feeds us the toxic narrative that family is everything, implying that we must tolerate abuse, manipulation, or criminal behavior simply because we share blood. We see this at traditional holiday dinner tables, where children are forced to smile and embrace relatives who cause them harm, all under the guise of respect. Ellie faced an agonizing spiritual test. Honoring her grandfather meant bringing the hammer of justice down on her own uncle. She chose the path of the spiritual warrior. She understood that you cannot heal a rotting branch by letting it infect the entire tree. Parents must teach their children that love and loyalty do not require self-immolation. It is spiritually imperative to teach our kids how to set ironclad boundaries. Show them that standing up for what is right sometimes means walking away from those who refuse to walk in the light. True resilience is having the courage to protect your sanctuary even when the threat comes from inside the house. Finally, we must encourage our children to dig deep rather than pave over. We live in an apex holdings culture, a society obsessed with bulldozing the uncomfortable, the old, and the complex, to build something shiny and artificial. When conflicts arise in our homes, our instinct is often to sweep the mess under the rug, prioritizing a peaceful facade over doing the hard, exhausting work of emotional repair. Spiritual growth is not found in the pristine subdivision. It is found in the mud, in the careful restoration of a cracked foundation, and in facing the heavy, messy truths of our past. Teach your children the value of slow, deliberate cultivation. Show them that doing the right thing is rarely cinematic or painless. It is often grueling, lonely work. When they make a mistake, do not rush to pave over the consequences. Sit in the dirt with them, hand them the mortar, and show them how to rebuild their character stone by stone. If navigating the messy, beautiful, and sometimes heartbreaking reality of family dynamics resonates with you, I invite you to like, subscribe, and follow the channel Sophie Tells Stories. Here we do not just recount events, we unearth the profound lessons buried beneath them, helping each other grow stronger with every tale shared. As you guide your children through this complex modern world, take a quiet moment to look at the foundation you are laying in your own home. When the corporate bulldozers of life arrive, when superficial temptations, societal pressures, and deep-seated fears threaten to level what you have built, what will remain standing? Prepare your children not just to survive the American economy, but to elevate the human spirit. Teach them to plant their feet firmly in the mud, and to know with absolute certainty that no amount of money can ever buy a clear conscience. And as the seasons change and the dust settles on your own domestic disputes, you must ask yourself one final question. When the winter frost thaws in your own life, what kind of seeds have you actually left buried beneath your floorboards waiting to bloom?